Welcome to our channel where stories aren't just told, they're a window into the human spirit. If you're someone who values empathy, justice, and truth, you've found your community. At 35,000 feet on a luxury flight to Paris, a powerful black CEO's first-class seat is taken by a wealthy socialite. Told she doesn't belong and pressured to move, Grace Turner makes a quiet stand that ignites a chain reaction, shaking an entire airline and proving that sometimes, a single seat can change everything. Before we get into the full story, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. If this story moves you, if it opens your eyes, stirs your heart, or simply makes you think, we invite you to leave a meaningful comment. And if you feel there's a deeper truth or a missing perspective, share your thoughts below. Your support helps us bring more real voices and honest conversations to light. Every click counts and every story matters. Now let's begin. Most people assume the battles that change history happen in courtrooms, at protests, or in powerful boardrooms. Rarely do they imagine one unfolding in the pressurized cabin of a luxury jet thousands of feet above the Atlantic. But for Grace Turner, a woman who had built bridges no one thought she could cross, the fight began with something as simple as a seat. A single first-class seat, upholstered in soft leather, gleaming under the cabin lights. Seat 18A. The seat she had paid for, the seat she had earned, and the seat someone had decided she wasn't worthy of occupying. Grace moved through JFK's glistening Terminal 4 with the measured grace of someone who had learned to command every room she entered, even when it wasn't built for her. At 54, the CEO of Turner Innovations didn't just look like she belonged among the platinum card travelers and tailored suit executives. She was the reason her company now led the global security tech industry. Yet for all her success, for all the magazine covers and industry accolades, there were still moments, too many moments, when the world found subtle ways to remind her of the barriers she had scaled. And tonight, on her way to Paris for a deal that could cement her legacy, one of those moments was waiting for her on Flight 442. Her father's worn leather notebook felt heavy in her carry-on, just as it always did when the stakes were high. The notebook still smelled faintly of the diesel buses he drove for 30 years in Detroit, its pages filled with quotes he had scribbled in neat cursive. Every time you rise, take others with you. Every time they try to move you, ask yourself who benefits if you step aside. Grace touched its spine before stepping onto the jet bridge, steadying herself not just for the meeting in Paris, but for the subtle, invisible negotiations that came with existing in spaces like this. When she reached her row, the evening's first crack appeared. Seat 18A, her window seat, was occupied not by a person, but by a creamy leather Chanel tote, its gleam almost mocking under the cabin lights. Its owner, Charlotte Whitmore, a woman with platinum blonde waves and a face carefully preserved by money and dermatology, didn't even glance up from her phone. Her manicured fingers scrolled across the glowing screen as if the world around her barely existed. Grace cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me, that's my seat," she said, polite but firm. Charlotte didn't look up. "I need the extra space," she murmured, her tone laced with a casual authority, the kind only someone accustomed to winning unspoken negotiations can muster. She gestured lazily toward her other designer luggage, tucked under the seat ahead. "There are plenty of other seats available. I'm sure you'll find something comfortable." Grace felt a familiar hot knot in her chest. The passengers boarding behind her began to bunch up, their murmurs and impatient shuffles adding weight to the moment. It was an old, exhausting calculus. Stand her ground and risk being labeled difficult, or yield and swallow the indignity for the sake of expedience. She thought of her meeting in Paris, the $300 million deal, and the weight of every young woman who had ever asked her, "How do you survive when they treat you like you don't belong?" Laura Simmons, the flight attendant, appeared, her smile practiced but cool. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her eyes flicking briefly from Grace to Charlotte and back to Grace as if deciding who would be easier to move. Charlotte answered before Grace could speak. "She's trying to take the seat I need. I don't feel comfortable being cramped." The words floated in the air like a live wire. "I don't feel comfortable." Grace had heard those words in boardrooms and restaurants, in neighborhoods where people crossed the street when she walked by. They were almost always weaponized and almost never questioned. Grace inhaled slow and deliberate, just as her therapist had taught her. She felt the old pages of her father's notebook pressing against her side, as if the weight itself were whispering, "Not today." She looked directly at Laura, her voice steady but edged with a calm power that made people listen. I paid for this seat. I will be sitting in this seat, or we can call the captain now and explain why your airline is about to make headlines for the wrong reasons. The cabin hushed for a heartbeat. A boy sitting 2 rows back, wide-eyed, maybe 10 years old, peeked over the seat back, clutching his mother's hand. Grace caught his gaze. If she stepped aside, what lesson would he take from this moment? And if she stood firm, what might he carry with him into a world already poised to doubt him? Somewhere deep in the fuselage, the engines began to hum, a reminder that this wasn't just a flight to Paris. This was something larger, something heavier, the kind of moment you don't walk away from unchanged. Grace Turner, who had built a career negotiating mergers and multi-million-dollar deals, understood something with startling clarity. This wasn't business. This was a line. And for the first time that day, she felt the faint spark of resolve flicker into a flame. The air inside the cabin felt different now, charged, expectant. The passengers were watching. The flight attendant was waiting. Charlotte's Chanel tote gleamed like a silent dare. And Grace Turner knew exactly what she would do next. Some battles aren't about comfort or convenience. Sometimes a single seat becomes a measure of dignity, and how you choose to hold it can echo far beyond the cabin walls. Grace Turner sat motionless for a beat, letting the hum of the engines and the shuffle of boarding passengers wash over her. In another life years ago, she might have swallowed the irritation, let it slide, and moved to another seat just to keep the peace. But now, watching Charlotte Whitmore's fingers flick across her phone as if the space she was taking didn't belong to someone else, Grace felt the familiar burn of something she had spent a lifetime tempering, the slow, creeping fire of indignation. It wasn't about the plush leather or the view of the Atlantic she'd planned to gaze out over. This was about the quiet, constant tug-of-war over spaces she had earned and the insidious suggestion that her claim to them was negotiable. The murmurs of other passengers swirled around her, snippets of half-heard comments drifting in the air like static. Some sounded annoyed, others curious, most indifferent. But none seemed to question the underlying absurdity that Grace, a woman who had navigated billion-dollar contracts, could still be made to feel like an intruder over a purchased seat. She glanced over her shoulder, not at the faces, but at a boy 2 rows back, maybe 10 years old, his dark eyes fixed on her with a mix of fear and expectation. His small hand was clasped in his mother's, her lips pressed into a tight line. Grace had seen that look before. She'd carried it herself as a girl, watching her father argue with a shopkeeper who claimed not to have change for his dollar, knowing full well why the man didn't want to deal with him. That memory pulled her back to Detroit in a heartbeat. She could almost smell the faint diesel lingering on her father's coat when he came home from late bus routes. His hands were calloused, his voice steady as he'd read lines from his notebook aloud while she sat on the kitchen floor with her math homework. Every space you claim, Gracie, you claim for more than yourself. If they can make you move today, they'll make the next person move tomorrow. Back then, she nodded absently, too young to know that he was speaking from scars she'd one day inherit. Tonight, those words rattled through her like steel cables, holding her spine upright. Charlotte's voice cut through Grace's thoughts, sharp and deliberate. Are we really going to hold up an entire plane over a seat? I said she could take another one. This is ridiculous. Charlotte's voice was pitched just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, inviting them to take her side, framing Grace as the obstacle to a smooth evening. Grace noticed the calculated pauses, the slight glance toward the flight attendant, and the unmistakable phrase, "I don't feel comfortable," laced into Charlotte's argument like a loaded trigger. Those 4 words had followed Grace her whole life, wielded by strangers in stores, colleagues in elevators, and neighbors when she walked her dog past the wrong block. Laura Simmons, still hovering with her service-trained smile, shifted her weight subtly toward Grace, not Charlotte, the universal signal for the one who should concede. "Miss Turner, perhaps we could relocate you to another available seat. Maybe even with more space. It's not a downgrade, I promise." Laura offered, her voice smoothing over the blatant breach of policy with the polish of someone who had done this dance too many times before. The words were honey, but the message was clear. It would be easier for everyone if Grace just moved. Grace thought again of the boy, his eyes wide and unblinking. What was he seeing? A woman backing down to keep the peace, or someone teaching him by example that standing firm doesn't always have to come with anger, but it must come with resolve? She met his gaze deliberately, offering the smallest nod. The boy straightened slightly in his seat, as if the moment had shifted something inside him. Her own past flooded her, uninvited but insistent. The investor meeting in Silicon Valley where a partner had handed his empty coffee cup to her because he assumed she was an assistant. The hotel in London that had lost her reservation until her CFO, a younger white man, showed up beside her. The time not so long ago when a security guard at a luxury retailer shadowed her through the aisles, only to apologize profusely when he saw her corporate credit card flash at checkout. The sting of each incident was dulled by time, but together they wove a tapestry of constant, quiet battles. Grace turned to Laura, her expression calm but unyielding. With respect, I'm not asking for a favor. I purchased 18A and I expect to sit in it. If we need to escalate this, I'm prepared to have that conversation with the captain, or with the European Aviation Safety Agency when we land in Paris. I'm sure they'd be interested in a report about how Trans Global handles passenger rights, especially when certain passengers are asked to give up what they paid for. Arthur Delgado, the flight supervisor, appeared then, drawn by the rising tension like a moth to a flame. His silver hair and impeccable uniform exuded authority, but his eyes betrayed calculation. Grace had been around long enough to recognize the mental math. Charlotte's connections, her husband's influence, the potential fallout of upsetting her versus the unknown cost of challenging Grace. Grace didn't flinch, didn't fidget, didn't offer any information about who she was or what power she might hold. She had learned long ago that people reveal their own priorities when they have to decide how to treat someone whose worth isn't immediately obvious. The cabin quieted, a collective breath held. Charlotte crossed her arms, her lips pursed, expecting someone, anyone, to bend to her comfort. Laura looked at Arthur. Arthur looked at Grace. And Grace kept her gaze steady, her father's words echoing once more in the quiet hum of the plane. Every space you claim for more than yourself. For the first time since she'd stepped onto the jet bridge, Grace smiled, not out of courtesy, but because she knew how this would end. Whether tonight or in the days to come, this wasn't just about 18A anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. Sometimes it takes strangers at 35,000 feet to remind you that you're not standing alone, even when every eye in the cabin feels like it's waiting for you to stumble. The first hour of Flight 442 passed in a strange, taut quiet, the sort of hush that settles after a storm, but hums with the promise of another. Grace Turner felt every shift in the cabin's energy, each sideways glance, each whispered comment that didn't quite reach her ears. She kept her posture straight, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her gaze fixed on the slow procession of clouds sliding by outside the window. Her seat, 18A, was hers as it always should have been, but the victory was hollow and electric at the same time. The air around her still felt charged like the aftermath of a lightning strike. It wasn't until a warm, deliberate voice floated from across the aisle that Grace's focus shifted. "Sugar, I've been waiting a long time to see someone hold their ground the way you just did." Grace turned to see a woman with silver hair cropped close to her head, her posture regal despite the confines of her seat. She wore a tailored plum pantsuit, a silver brooch in the shape of Africa pinned to her lapel. Her presence radiated the kind of quiet authority that comes only from decades of surviving, observing, and teaching. "I'm Rosalind Hayes," the woman continued, extending a hand. "Retired professor from Howard University. Spent 40 years teaching history, mostly about patterns like this, how they repeat themselves even when we think we've buried them." Her grip was firm, her eyes sharp and kind all at once. Grace shook her hand, feeling a flicker of something unexpected, solidarity, warm and grounding, breaking through the tension that had been tightening around her since boarding. Rosalind leaned back slightly, her voice pitched so only Grace and a few nearby could hear. "First time I flew first class was in 1964. Paid my fare same as everyone else, dressed in my Sunday best, because Mama said we had to look better than perfect to even be allowed near the gate. And yet the stewardess told me I'd be more comfortable in the back. Rules were changing by law but not by heart. I sat right there in that seat and told her I wasn't moving. Didn't say it loud, didn't make a scene, but I stayed planted. Been telling my students about that flight for years, about how every generation gets tested over and over." The words settled into Grace like stones in a riverbed, anchoring her. She realized this wasn't just her test. It was part of something larger, a chain of defiance stretching back generations. Her father's words. Rosalind's story. They were threads of the same fabric woven long before she'd ever boarded this plane. A few rows ahead, Marcus Lee glanced back, his eyes catching Grace's for the first time since the confrontation. Marcus had built his reputation as a venture capitalist with an uncanny sense for people. The kind who saw potential where others only saw risk. Years ago, when Turner Innovations was little more than a scrappy startup with a promising prototype, Marcus had written the first significant check. Now, watching Grace hold her composure, his lips curved into a barely perceptible smile. The kind of acknowledgement that said he knew she was still fighting battles most of their peers couldn't even see. He didn't speak, but the subtle nod he offered carried a simple message. I see you. I respect you. Keep going. Meanwhile, 2 rows back, Sophia Mitchell adjusted her tablet, pretending to review notes while discreetly recording observations. Sophia was a junior at Howard, working on her thesis about racial bias in public and semi-private spaces, hotels, restaurants, airports. She hadn't expected to find a living case study at 35,000 feet. But her stylus flew across the screen as she catalogued every nuance. The language choices, the tones of voice, the body language, even the way the flight crew had shifted their warmth and distance between passengers. This was more than just data for her paper. It felt like witnessing a moment that might ripple outward, one she'd one day reference in presentations or conversations when people claimed such patterns no longer existed. The air, still tinged with tension, began to take on a different weight, not lighter but steadier. It was no longer just Grace against the entitled and indifferent. Invisible threads of support stretched across the cabin. Rosalind's lived wisdom, Marcus's silent respect, Sophia's watchful documentation. These weren't grand gestures or overt allies waving banners, but they were there holding space with her. Charlotte Whitmore, perhaps sensing the subtle shift in energy, tapped at her phone more aggressively, her diamond ring catching the light like a strobe. She radiated irritation, her shoulders stiff, her glances sharp and fleeting toward Grace. The power dynamic had tilted, not dramatically but perceptibly, and she didn't seem to know what to do with the unease. Grace, however, felt a clarity she hadn't expected. For the first time since the confrontation, her pulse began to slow. She thought of Rosalind's story, of Marcus's nod, of Sophia's intent gaze. And she thought of that boy 2 rows back, his wide eyes fixed not in fear now, but in something else, anticipation, maybe even hope. She imagined him years from now, recalling this flight not as the day he watched a black woman get shuffled aside, but as the day he saw one stand her ground with dignity and quiet strength and watched others rise, not loudly, not dramatically but unmistakably, to stand with her. Leaning slightly toward Rosalind, Grace lowered her voice. If I get this deal closed in Paris, I'm starting something new. A foundation. Scholarships, mentorship, maybe even a legal fund for people who face this kind of thing every day and don't have the leverage to fight back. Something that lasts longer than any flight. Rosalind's eyes lit with approval, the kind of look only a teacher who spent a lifetime nurturing courage could give. That's how you make the stand matter, sugar. Not just for you, but for the next 1,000 souls who don't even know yet they'll need someone to fight for them. Above them, the plane cut smoothly through a stretch of midnight sky, the world below hidden beneath miles of dark ocean. The cabin lights dimmed as passengers settled into their seats, some oblivious, some watching quietly, all of them sharing the same thin slice of air in a metal vessel hurtling across continents. Grace glanced once more at the boy, now asleep against his mother's side, his small chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. For the first time all evening, Grace let herself exhale fully. She wasn't just holding a seat anymore. She was holding something far heavier and far more enduring. And for the first time that night she felt ready to carry it. Sometimes change doesn't come through shouting or speeches, but in the moments when chaos hits and humanity peeks through the cracks. The first shudder of turbulence hit without warning, a sudden drop that pulled gasps from lips and made glasses rattle in their holders. The plane seemed to lurch downward before steadying itself, but the tension that gripped the cabin didn't fade as quickly as the dip itself. Seat belts clicked as passengers instinctively tightened them, eyes darting to the overhead signs that now glowed amber. Grace Turner felt the jolt in her chest as much as her body, but she didn't reach for the armrest like so many around her. Instead, she closed her eyes for a beat, finding the rhythm of her breathing as the plane rocked again. Beside her, Charlotte Whitmore wasn't as steady. A splash of sparkling water leapt from the crystal tumbler in her hand, spotting her cream cashmere sleeve with expanding stains. Her gasp was sharp, bordering on theatrical, and she twisted toward Grace with an incredulous glare. You bumped me, she hissed, her tone less accusation than declaration, as if willing her words into fact. The logic was impossible. Grace hadn't moved and no one controlled the sky, but Charlotte's need to assign blame was stronger than reason. Grace opened her eyes, turning her head slowly to meet Charlotte's glare. There was no heat in her expression, just a quiet steadiness sharpened by years of these small, relentless provocations. Her voice, when it came, was calm and level. Mrs. Whitmore, I can't control the atmosphere. None of us can. Charlotte bristled, dabbing furiously at the stains with a cocktail napkin that only deepened the marks. You've been nothing but hostile since you got on this plane, she muttered, her voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, a tactic Grace recognized immediately. Shift the narrative, frame herself as the victim, and let the audience fill in the rest. Grace inhaled again, drawing the breath deep into her diaphragm, holding it, then releasing it slowly as her therapist had taught her. In for 4, hold for 7, out for 8. Each cycle calmed the sharp edge of frustration that threatened to bubble up. Mrs. Whitmore, Grace said softly, her tone even but deliberate, I haven't spoken a word to you since I sat down. I'm just existing in the space I paid for. She didn't raise her voice, didn't lace her words with sharpness, but each syllable landed like a quiet rebuke, a reminder that her presence alone wasn't aggression, no matter how it was being cast. Charlotte's lips tightened, her knuckles whitening on the edge of the armrest. As the plane dipped again, her discomfort seemed to expand beyond the stains, spilling into every jitter of turbulence. Her chest rose in shallow bursts, her face paling as another tremor rippled through the fuselage. For the first time since boarding, the arrogance softened into something more human. Fear. Grace recognized it instantly. She'd seen the same signs in her daughter Maya during long-haul flights, the panic building with every shake of the cabin. She could have ignored it, a part of her wanted to. But another part, the one her father had nurtured with late-night words and her mother had fortified with quiet strength, knew this was the moment when she had to be bigger than the conflict. Grace leaned slightly toward Charlotte, her voice lowering just enough to cut through the hum of engines without drawing attention. Breathe with me, she said, her tone as gentle as if she were speaking to Maya herself. In for 4, hold for 7, out for 8. It helps. Charlotte glanced at her, startled, caught between pride and need. Another drop in altitude made the decision for her. She mirrored Grace's inhale, her chest rising in sync, then held, then exhaled in a measured release. They repeated the cycle twice, 3 times, the trembling in Charlotte's hands subsiding as the rhythm took hold. Her shoulders loosened fractionally, the panic ebbing, replaced by a reluctant steadiness. Grace offered no commentary, no pointed remarks, just the breathing pattern and a quiet steadiness to match the rocking cabin. For a brief stretch, the space between them shifted, not warm, not reconciled, but human. 2 women sharing the same narrow slice of sky, subject to the same laws of physics, the same fragile mortality, stripped of status and posturing by the raw reminder that none of it shields anyone from a storm. When the seatbelt sign finally dimmed and the plane leveled, the quiet between them lingered, softer than before. Charlotte straightened her sweater, avoiding Grace's gaze, and tapped at her phone again, her persona sliding back into place. Grace turned to her laptop, her fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard as she opened a folder labeled, The Horizon Protocol. For 2 years she had been building this file. Incident reports, testimonies, datasets, legal precedents. What had begun as a private ledger, notes about moments like the one she just endured, had grown into a comprehensive blueprint for change. She attached a summary of the latest events to an email for her legal team, instructing them to draft a formal proposal to present to regulators on both sides of the Atlantic. By the time Flight 442 touched down, the wheels would already be turning. Charlotte shifted in her seat, making a show of turning away, but Grace didn't notice. Her attention was on the screen, on the blueprint, on the long game. The turbulence in the air had passed, but the real transformation, the one that mattered, was just beginning. Some journeys don't end when the wheels touch the runway. Sometimes they become the spark that changes how everyone travels forward. As the lights of Paris glittered beneath the descending plane, Grace Turner didn't look out the window. Her eyes stayed on the glowing screen in front of her, scanning the final lines of the message she had drafted for her legal team. The turbulence had subsided, but the energy from the cabin confrontation lingered, humming beneath her skin like an aftershock. This flight had stopped being about Paris hours ago. Now it was about something larger, something her father's words had always hinted at. Every space you hold for more than yourself. Tonight she'd felt the full weight of that truth. When the plane touched down and the tires met the tarmac with a low groan, Grace closed her laptop. Around her, passengers moved quickly, reclaiming bags from the overhead bins, checking their phones as if the hours in the sky hadn't shifted anything. But Grace could see its small traces of something different. The boy too rose back, stealing one last look at her before being ushered into the aisle. Rosalind Hayes, meeting her eyes with a nod that held the gravity of decades lived in defiance. Sophia Mitchell, sliding her tablet into her bag, her expression alight with the quiet thrill of a student who knew she'd just witnessed history for her thesis and beyond. Charlotte Whitmore stood, clutching her Chanel tote like armor, avoiding Grace's gaze. Her lips were pressed thin, her usual confidence rattled but not shattered. Before she stepped into the aisle, she paused, her voice low enough that only Grace could hear. "My husband's firm is looking for new cybersecurity solutions. Perhaps Turner Innovations can send a proposal." Wasn't contrition, not really. It was something murkier. A mix of reluctant acknowledgement and self-preservation. Grace simply nodded, her face calm, offering no promise beyond professional courtesy. Respect, after all, was not a favor to be bartered. Outside the jet bridge, a man in a navy suit with silvering hair waved his Trans-Global ID badge, catching the terminal's bright light. James Foster, the airline's director of operations, introduced himself with a quiet firmness. "Miss Turner, I was on that flight, observing as part of our executive review program. What happened wasn't acceptable. I'd like to speak with you not as a courtesy, but as the first step in making sure it doesn't happen again." Grace studied him, searching for the flicker of defensiveness she so often encountered in these conversations, but found none. His posture, his tone, it wasn't performance. It was someone ready to listen because the cost of not listening had finally become clear. An hour later, in a quiet conference room near Charles de Gaulle Airport, Grace laid out her vision. The Horizon Protocol, she explained, would set a new industry standard. Mandatory anti-bias and empathy training designed by behavioral experts, transparent reporting for all passenger complaints, independent audits, and a compensation structure for executives tied directly to measurable improvements in passenger equity. It wouldn't just patch a PR wound. It would rewire how the airline treated human dignity. "You can lead the industry," she told James, her voice steady, "or be dragged behind it when change becomes unavoidable." James, to his credit, didn't argue. "We'll lead," he said finally. "I'll bring it to Harding myself, and if he hesitates, I'll remind him how quickly an FAA investigation can ground an entire fleet." Days later, Grace stood in the Paris boardroom of All-Aris Technologies, her presentation for the $300 million partnership flowing as smoothly as the Seine beyond the windows. She closed the deal as expected, her voice confident and measured. Yet as the executives applauded and handshakes followed, her thoughts drifted not to the numbers on the page, but to the message from James Foster waiting on her phone. Harding approved. Horizon Protocol implementation begins immediately. The board is unanimous. Changes in motion. Weeks passed. At airports across the US and Europe, small pins appeared on flight attendants' uniforms, a globe etched with equal signs. The new standard announcements played at the start of every trans-global flight. "Our crew is committed to ensuring every passenger in every seat is treated with dignity and respect throughout our journey together." It was a sentence Grace had written herself, not as marketing but as a promise. Rosalind Hayes sent her a letter, handwritten in looping cursive. "I've flown for 60 years, sugar, and I've never seen change come this fast. Maybe this time the altitude really did shift." Grace read the note in her office, sunlight spilling over the skyline beyond the glass. Her daughter Maya sat across from her, listening as Grace recounted the story. Not the Paris deal, not the headlines about Transglobal, but the seat, the stand, and the people who had watched it unfold. "Sometimes," Grace told her, "the real deals we make aren't on paper. They're in moments like that one, where the cost of silence finally outweighs the risk of speaking up." Maya's eyes, bright with the same determination that had carried Grace through boardrooms and battles, reflected something more. The certainty that she would inherit not just her mother's legacy, but the courage to forge her own. Grace turned to the window, watching a jet cut through the clouds above the city. High in the sky, every traveler was the same, reliant on the same engines, carried by the same lift, bound by the same laws of physics. It was a reminder that no amount of privilege or prejudice could rewrite that truth. For the first time in years, Grace felt something lighter than relief or victory. It was purpose. Not the kind you build a company on, but the kind you carry quietly from one space to the next until the world no longer questions whether you belong. The sky above Paris was pale gold as another plane climbed through it, its contrail drawing a clean line across the horizon. Grace followed it with her eyes, a small smile touching her lips. The battles weren't over, but for the first time she felt certain that the altitude, for her, for Maya, for every passenger who would ever sit in a seat they'd paid for, was beginning to change. Grace Turner's flight to Paris began as a business trip but became a crucial battle for dignity. It started with a single-seat 18A and Charlotte Whitmore's designer tote, a silent, entitled challenge to Grace's right to be there. What unfolded was a reminder that even with all the markers of success, the subtle weight of bias can press down like unexpected turbulence. Grace stood her ground, not with aggression, but with the steady resolve her father had taught her. Every time she claimed space, she was holding it for more than herself. Her calm refusal became a quiet lesson to every eye in the cabin. Dignity isn't negotiable, even when convenience whispers that giving in would be easier. But the story didn't end on the runway. The allies who revealed themselves mid-air, the retired professor, the silent venture capitalist, the young student, were proof that standing firm can create a ripple effect. Even Charlotte, rattled by turbulence, became an unlikely part of the shift, her demeanor softening just enough for humanity to peek through. By the time Flight 442 touched down, Grace had done more than hold her seat. She'd set in motion the Horizon Protocol, a systemic transformation that would ripple through the entire industry, ensuring every passenger is treated with the dignity they deserve. The lesson in Grace Turner's story is not just about air travel or boardroom power. It's about understanding that change rarely arrives wrapped in ceremony. It's born in the moments when we refuse to yield, even when every pressure around us says to give way. It's about remembering that courage can be calm, that leadership can look like a steady breath in the face of hostility, and that the stands we take, big or small, can echo far beyond the spaces we occupy. For everyone listening, the challenge is clear. In your own life, you will face moments where your worth is questioned, your belonging challenged, or your dignity weighed against someone else's comfort. In those moments, remember Grace's lesson. Stand steady. Breathe deep. Claim your space. Not just for yourself but for those watching, those who will come after you, and for a world that can only change when enough people decide that the cost of silence is too high. If this story moved you, inspired you, or even made you reflect on your own experiences, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling these powerful, real stories. Stories that reveal truth, spark change, and remind us all that some journeys aren't just about reaching a destination. They're about lifting everyone a little higher along the way. Stay with us because the next story might be the one that helps you change your own altitude.